She looked at my scar like it was nothing. A widow's courage healed the man. No one could, The letter had taken 10 years to burn. Caleb Hargrove stood in the ruins of the old feed shed, the one the lightning had taken 2 summers ago, the one he hadn't bothered to rebuild, and watched the single page catch and blacken at the edges. The words went first, then the careful loops of her handwriting, then the paper itself folding inward like something ashamed of existing. He watched until there was nothing left but a curl of gray ash on the scorched ground. Then he turned and walked back to the house. The night was still. Red Mesa, Texas held its breath in the deep heat of late June 1883, the air thick with the smell of baked earth and the distant sweetness of sage. In the big house, his mother had always called it the big house, 6 rooms and a parlor that had never once hosted a dinner party. A single lamp burned in the kitchen window. Gus Parrish had left it on. His foreman had a habit of doing that, leaving lights burning in empty rooms as though light alone could make a place feel inhabited. It couldn't. Caleb went inside, poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey and didn't drink it, stood at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood and stared at nothing in particular. He was 39 years old. He owned 600 acres of the best grazing land in Carver County, 200 horses that other men traveled 3 days to buy, and a reputation that made strangers cross the street before he'd open his mouth. He had built everything he owned with his own hands, beginning at 21, when his father died and left him 40 acres and a debt. He had fought drought thieves, a cattle fever that took 30 head in a single autumn, and a range war that had nearly cost him his life twice. He had survived all of it. The one thing he hadn't survived was a woman in a hospital room saying 7 words in a voice so carefully controlled it could have been discussing the weather. The scar ran from the outer corner of his left eye down to his jaw. It had been worse in the beginning, raw and red, the kind of wound that made people flinch and look away quickly. Now it was just part of his face, a pale ridge, slightly raised, that caught the light, sometimes in a way that made him look like a man divided into 2 halves, the one he'd been before the fire and the one he'd been since. Lydia Ashworth had decided she could only love the first half. Caleb picked up the whiskey glass, looked at it for a moment, and set it back down untouched. He was done drinking to the memory of her. He was done with the whole enterprise. In fact, the remembering, the wondering, the stupid nightly accounting of all the ways things might have been different. He had burned the letter. That chapter was closed. He went to bed. He did not sleep for a very long time. 3 days later, the afternoon stage from San Antonio was 40 minutes late. Nobody in Red Mesa was surprised. The stage was almost always late. What surprised them was the woman who stepped off it. She wore black, not the fresh, expensive black of a recent widow, but the worn, traveled black of a woman who had been in mourning long enough for the color to fade to something closer to charcoal. Her boots were cracked at the toes. The single trunk she pulled down from the luggage rack was held together at one corner with a length of rope. But she stood on that dusty platform with her chin lifted and her amber eyes moving across the town in a slow, deliberate survey, as though she were taking inventory and deciding whether the merchandise was worth the trouble. Nora Vance had learned in 34 years of living that the way you stood when you arrived somewhere new told people everything they needed to know about whether you could be pushed around. She intended to tell them she could not. The station master approached, hat already in hand. "Ma'am, you got folks meeting you." "No." "Got a place to stay?" "Not yet." He scratched the back of his neck. "Got any, begging your pardon, money?" Nora opened the small purse at her wrist and withdrew $3 silver. Everything she had left after the train from St. Louis, after the cheap room in San Antonio, after selling her mother's cameo brooch to a jeweler on Commerce Street who had given her half what it was worth and hadn't bothered to hide his satisfaction about it. "Enough for a room," she said. The station master seemed to be calculating something behind his eyes. Then he pointed down the main street. "Agnes Draper runs the boarding house. $2 a week meals. She's fair, but she's got rules. I can follow rules." "Yes, ma'am." He paused. "Begging your pardon again, what brings you to Red Mesa? We ain't exactly a destination." Nora picked up one end of her trunk. "Neither was anywhere else I could afford to be." She walked down the main street alone, one end of the trunk dragging slightly on the uneven boards. She passed the bank, where a woman in pale yellow silk stood in the window, and watched her with an expression that could have meant anything. She passed the livery, where 2 men paused mid-conversation to stare. She passed the church, where a lean man with a cane and a preacher's collar tipped his hat with what seemed like genuine kindness. She counted 14 buildings, 26 horses, one water trough. Zero opportunities as far as she could see. But Nora Vance had survived worse than a small town with nothing to offer. She had survived Edmund. She had survived the men who came to the house after he died, polite men with the leather satchels and cold eyes presenting documents she hadn't known existed debts. She hadn't known he'd run names of farmers and small businessmen who had paid Edmund Vance for insurance policies that had never been filed with any company. She had survived St. Louis society's quiet, devastating withdrawal, the invitations that stopped coming, the women who smiled at her in church and then crossed the street. She had survived the shame of knowing, in the last year of her marriage, what Edmund was doing and saying nothing. That last survival was the hardest. The others had been done to her. That one she'd done to herself. She would not do it again. Agnes Draper's boarding house had a green door and a porch with two rocking chairs that looked like they had held many women's troubles over the years. Agnes herself was in the doorway before Nora reached the porch steps, a small, sharp woman with steel gray hair pinned tight and eyes that missed nothing. "You look like you've been traveling hard," Agnes said, not unkindly, just observing. 8 days from St. Louis. Rooms $2. 3 meals. No men past sundown, no trouble at any hour. You cause problems, your trunk will be on the porch before it gets dark. She studied Nora for a moment. "You running from something or running to something, running to somewhere I can start over." "Most people say that. Half of them are lying." "I'm not." Agnes was quiet for long enough that it became uncomfortable. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in and eat something. You can tell me the rest while you do." Nora told her enough. Not everything. Not the insurance fraud, not the farmers who had lost their savings, not the year of silence she carried like a stone in her chest. But she told the truth about Edmund, dying, about the debts, about Philadelphia. St. Louis, whatever city had decided it no longer had room for her. Agnes listened without interrupting, which Nora found she liked enormously. "Widow," Agnes said when Nora finished. "How old are you?" 34. "Any children?" "No." Edmund had not wanted children. Edmund had not wanted much, as it turned out, except money he hadn't earned and a wife who would look the other way. Agnes nodded slowly. "There's a man named Abernathy runs the general store. His daughter's leaving next month, getting married, moving to Dallas. He'll need help with the counter and the books. I'll put in a word if you want, but you'll have to do the asking yourself. He don't hire on my say-so." "I'll ask myself," Nora said. "That's how I prefer to do things." Something shifted in Agnes Draper's face, not quite a smile, but the ancestor of one. "Good. I have a feeling about you, Mrs. Vance. I'm usually right about these things." She stood and began clearing the supper plates. "Sleep. Tomorrow's soon enough for the rest of it." Yeah. The first 4 days in Red Mesa, Nora learned the shape of the place. She learned that Franklin Caldwell ran the only bank and the only real money, and that his daughter Vivian moved through the town's social life the way a hawk moves through a chicken yard, with supreme confidence and the general understanding that she could take what she wanted. She learned that Reverend Elias Cross had fought at Chickamauga and walked with a cane on rainy days and could silence a room with a look that had nothing to do with religious authority and everything to do with having once carried a dead man 3 miles through winter mud to give him a proper burial. She learned that Jesse Crane was 15 years old and working odd jobs for Agnes, chopping wood and hauling water, and that his mother was in the back bedroom of their small house near the livery, coughing herself thinner by the week. She learned about Caleb Hargrove the way she learned everything else in pieces from people who volunteered at Sideways. "The Stone Horseman," Jesse told her on the morning she found him splitting wood behind the boarding house. He said it the way people say a name that means something more than just a name. "Why do they call him that?" Jesse set down the axe and wiped his face with his sleeve. He was all knobby joints, an Adam's apple with eyes that were older than his years, in the particular way of children who have had to become small adults too soon. "On account of his horses and his heart," he said. "Got the best horses in 3 counties. Won't let anybody near the other thing." "What happened to it, the other thing?" Jesse shrugged, but Nora could see him deciding how much to say. "Fire burned down his stable about 10 years back. He ran in to save the horses, got burned bad. Had a woman supposed to marry her. She came to see him while he was healing." He paused. "She left, on account of his face after." Nora's hands went still on the laundry she'd been folding. "She left because of the scar. That's what folks say. He ain't talked about it to nobody." Jesse picked up the axe again. Then very quietly looking at the woodpile, my pa used to work for him. Used to? Caleb fired him. 3 years ago. The axe came down, the log split cleanly. Said he was taking money from the wrong people. Pa said it was lies. Another swing. Pa left after that, hasn't been back. Nora considered this carefully. Do you believe it, what Caleb said about your father? Jesse didn't answer. He just kept splitting wood with the concentrated fury of a boy who had not yet decided which version of the story he was going to live with. She didn't push. On the 5th day, she walked into Abernathy's general store and made her proposition. 1 week free of charge. If she was useful, he paid her going forward. If not, he'd lost nothing but a little counter space. Mr. Abernathy was a small, round man with spectacles that sat slightly crooked on his nose and the permanently distracted air of someone who was always keeping 3 sets of numbers in his head at once. He studied her for long enough that she began to think she'd have to make the offer again. Then he said, "You know bookkeeping. I taught music theory for 4 years. Music theory is arithmetic with aesthetics. I know bookkeeping." He almost smiled at that. "You know how to deal with difficult customers." Nora thought about Edmund's creditors, about the men who had come to the house with their cold eyes and their leather satchels, and how she had stood at the door and spoken to each of them with perfect composure, even the ones who had been unkind. "I know how to deal with difficult people," she said. "They're mostly the same thing." 1 week, he said, "starting tomorrow, 6 in the morning. Don't be late." She was not late. The morning of her 3rd day behind Abernathy's counter, Nora was cataloging a shipment of dry goods when she heard the door open and felt before she turned the specific quality of silence that enters a room with certain people, the kind of silence that means something has shifted. She turned. Caleb Hargrove stood in the doorway. He was tall, over 6 feet, and built like a man who had spent his whole life in argument with the land and had been winning most of the time. He wore a work shirt, faded blue with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. His dark hair was damp at the temples. His jaw was set in an expression that suggested he had arrived for a specific purpose and intended to accomplish it and leave without any unnecessary conversation. The scar ran from the outer corner of his left eye to his jaw. Nora saw it the way she saw everything, directly, without flinching, without the small, involuntary recoil she had seen in other people's faces when they first encountered something unexpected. It was a scar. It told a story she didn't yet know. Stories in her experience were worth knowing. He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, quick, unguarded, gone. "Mr. Tucker," Abernathy began, emerging from the back room. "Hargrove," the man said without heat. It was a correction he had clearly made many times. "Mr. Hargrove, orders are ready. Got that harness leather you needed, too." Caleb nodded, once his eyes moving back to Nora. "Nora," Abernathy said, "Can you help Mr. Hargrove with his supplies while I finish the ledger?" "Of course." She came out from behind the counter and walked toward the shelves where the ranch supplies were kept. She heard him follow his boots on the board floor unhurried. The space between them as she walked felt charged in a way she didn't have a name for, like weather. "Harness leather's on the top shelf," she said. "You'll need the step stool." "I'll manage." He reached past her without difficulty and pulled down the coil of leather. Their hands did not quite touch. Nora did not quite step back. "You're new," he said, a statement, not quite a question. 3rd day behind the counter, new to town about a week. "From where?" "St. Louis, most recently." Before that, various places that no longer felt like home. He studied her with those storm gray eyes, the color of clouds before rain, the color of water in deep shadow. Running from something. That seems to be the first thing people ask here. It's a logical question. People come to Red Mesa for 2 reasons: they were born here and couldn't leave, or they needed somewhere nobody would look for them, or they needed to start again in a place where no one had already decided who they were. Something shifted in his expression. A small shift, barely visible the way a door moves when someone puts a hand on it from the other side without turning the knob. "That's a 3rd reason," he said. "It is." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. That was the strange thing. Nora had spent years in a house full of silences that were uncomfortable silences, loaded with Edmund's moods, his resentments, his shifting cruelties. This silence was different. It had weight without malice. "I should tell you," Caleb said after a moment, "that Charlotte Prescott is going to pay you a visit, if she hasn't already." Nora raised her eyebrows slightly. "Is that a warning?" "It's information. She runs the social calendar in this town, and she's been trying to—" He stopped, chose his words with what seemed like unusual care. She's been determined about certain things for a while. You being here is going to complicate her plans. I have no plans that involve anyone named Charlotte Prescott. Her name is Vivian Caldwell. He said it without expression, and she's about to have plans that involve you. He paid for his leather and the other supplies Abernathy had boxed up, settled his account with the same precise count of coins she had noticed him use with everything. Nothing approximate about him, nothing wasted, and walked to the door. There he paused, not turning back fully, just stopping one hand on the doorframe. The music, he said. Nora blinked. I beg your pardon. The piano in the corner. He nodded toward the old upright piano that sat in the back corner of the store, half hidden behind a stack of feed sacks. It was badly out of tune. She had noticed it her first morning. It was Mrs. Holstead's. She sold it to Abernathy when her family moved south. Do you play heroism? I taught it for 4 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he left. Nora stood by the supply shelves for a while after he'd gone, her hand resting on a bolt of canvas, listening to the sound of hooves moving away down the street. She told herself firmly, thinking about anything in particular. She was simply noticing that the air in the room felt slightly different now than it had an hour ago. More like weather, more like the particular tension before the first rain of the season. She told herself, going to be very careful. That evening, she met Vivian Caldwell. Vivian came into the store at the end of Nora's shift in the last half hour, before Abernathy locked up, alone, her pale yellow, silk immaculate. Despite the heat, her blonde hair curled in a way that required time and assistance, and probably the assistance of someone paid to provide it. She was beautiful in the way that certain things are beautiful, and also dangerous, sharp at the edges, carefully arranged. Mrs. Vance, she said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. I've been meaning to introduce myself. Miss Caldwell? Nora continued straightening the bolts of fabric on the shelf behind the counter. She did not make the mistake of giving Vivian her full attention immediately. She had learned in the years of managing Edmund's social obligations that the first person to shift their posture lost a small but significant advantage. Vivian moved to the counter and set her gloved hands on it. I wanted to welcome you to Red Mesa. It must be quite a change coming from a city. Change was what I was after. Of course. A small pause, precisely calibrated. I also wanted to offer a word of friendly advice. Woman to woman. Nora turned then, folding a bolt of calico with unhurried hands. I'm listening. Caleb Hargrove was in here today. Vivian said it as though this were information Nora might not possess. He was. He spoke to you. He did. He needed harness leather. Vivian's smile tightened by a fraction. Caleb doesn't come to town for harness leather. He sends Gus for supplies. When Caleb comes to town himself, it means something. She leaned forward slightly. I've known Caleb for years, Mrs. Vance. I understand how he works. A woman arriving alone with nothing, someone he can feel sorry for. I don't need anyone's sympathy. No, that's not what I was going to say. Vivian's voice dropped, became something closer to honest, though still controlled. I was going to say that a woman arriving alone is exactly the kind of person Caleb's protective instincts attach to. He's been isolated for years. He's looking for something to care about without realizing it. And women, like women in difficult circumstances, she paused with practiced delicacy, sometimes take advantage of that. Nora set down the bolt of calico and met Vivian's eyes directly. Miss Caldwell, I came to Red Mesa to find work and rebuild a life that was taken apart by someone else's choices. I have no designs on any man in this town, and I would strongly suggest that the next time you want to warn a woman away from something you haven't actually offered her, you find a less condescending way to do it. Vivian's eyes went very still. Then with precise composure, she picked up a pair of gloves from the display case, examined them, set them back. I see. Well, I've said what I came to say. She left. Abernathy emerged from the back room 5 minutes later, looked at Nora's face, and decided to say nothing. He was a wise man that way. No. The warning came from an unexpected direction. 3 mornings after Nora arrived, she was hanging sheets on Agnes's back line when Jesse Crane appeared around the corner of the house. He stopped when he saw her. He had the particular posture of someone who had intended to do something and was now reconsidering. Mrs. Vance? He said it carefully, the way you say a thing when you haven't decided yet whether you have the right to say the rest of it. Jesse? He came forward, stood a few feet away with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the middle distance. He was a good-looking boy, Nora thought, which would be a striking man someday if life gave him half a chance to get there. Right now, he was all elbows and watchfulness and suppressed anger. Caleb Hargrove comes around. You should know something about him, Jesse said. What should I know? My father worked for him. 3 years ago, Caleb said he found evidence my pa was taking payments from the Delacroix brothers. You know about them. No, horse thieves working the northern ranges. They had 3 or 4 men on different ranches feeding them information about which horses were worth taking, which nights the hands were short, things like that. Jesse's jaw tightened. Caleb said my pa was one of them. Fired him on the spot. Didn't go to the sheriff, just fired him and spread the word so nobody else in the county would hire him. My pa left 6 months later. We haven't heard from him in 2 years. Nora waited. My ma thinks Caleb was wrong, Jesse said. That somebody set my pa up, but he stopped. But what? The boy was quiet for a long time. But I found something in my pa's things after he left. Letters from a man named Delacroix. Not proof of anything exactly, but he looked at his boots. I don't know what I think anymore. I just know that Caleb Hargrove ruined my father's life, and now my ma is sick, and there's nothing I can do about any of it. Nora finished pinning the sheet and turned to face him. Why are you telling me this? Jesse looked up. Because you were decent to me, and I didn't want you to, he struggled with the words. I didn't want you to get caught up in something without knowing. Knowing what exactly that Caleb Hargrove may have ruined an innocent man's life, or that the situation is more complicated than that. Jesse stared at her. You don't know him. No, I don't. She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon, and at the end of the day when Caleb came back to the store, not for supplies this time, just appearing in the doorway in the quiet hour before closing, when Abernathy had gone to the church meeting, she asked him directly. Jesse Crane told me about his father. Caleb's expression did not change. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. Did he? He said you fired him for working with the Delacroix brothers and ruined his reputation in the county. I fired him because I found evidence he was feeding information to the Delacroix operation. 3 horses taken from the northern pasture in a single night the night after I told my crew I was taking the hands off that side for fence repair. The only ones who knew that were me, Gus, and Tom Crane. He said it without heat, just the facts set down carefully. Jesse found letters from Delacroix and his father's things. Caleb was silent for a moment. I know. I also know Tom Crane could have been set up. The letters could be planted. I'm not certain I was right. I'm certain I had to do something with the information I had at the time. He looked at her steadily. Was I wrong? Maybe. Did Tom Crane suffer for it regardless? Yes. Do I have a way to undo that? No. Nora felt something tighten in her chest. Not because what he'd said was wrong, it wasn't, but because of how familiar it sounded. The weight of it. The specific gravity of a decision you can't know was right, and that hurt someone regardless. She spoke before she thought it through. My husband was a fraud, she said. He sold insurance policies that didn't exist to farmers and small businessmen who couldn't afford to lose the money. He did it for years. And in the last year before he died, I knew. I didn't know the full extent of it, but I knew enough. And I said nothing. She stopped. I stayed because I didn't know what would happen to me if I left, and because I told myself the evidence wasn't certain, and because every reason I gave myself was true and none of them were good enough. The silence in the store was very complete. Caleb looked at her for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough and without any trace of judgment. You think that makes you a criminal? Or do you think it makes you someone who was surviving the only way she knew how? Nora felt the words land in her chest with a force that surprised her. She had expected sympathy or condemnation or the careful nothing of someone who didn't want to engage. She had not expected someone to see directly to the center of the thing she had never been able to resolve in herself. She did not answer. She couldn't. Caleb straightened from the doorframe. There's no answer to that question, he said quietly. I've been carrying a version of it myself for a while. I've noticed that the questions that matter most don't come with answers. They just come with the choice of whether to keep walking or stop. He left. Nora stood behind the counter for a long time after. Her hand was pressed flat against her sternum, against the place where his words had struck. She was in trouble. She knew it as clearly as she had ever known anything. She had arrived in Red Mesa with walls built so high, she had almost forgotten what the sky looked like from the other side of them. And this man, this scarred, guarded, impossible man, had looked at her across a counter full of bolts of fabric and said the truest thing anyone had said to her in years. She was in serious, serious trouble, and she was not. She realized with the feeling like stepping off a porch in the dark and finding the ground exactly where you expected it, entirely sure she wanted to get out of it. When? The night before the church social, Agnes told her about Lydia Ashworth. They were sitting on the porch in the dark, the kind of dark that comes in small Texas towns, where nobody wastes lamp oil, the stars overhead thick enough to read by if you had the patience. Agnes had brought out 2 glasses of something cold and sweet that Nora didn't ask about and just drank. You need to know the full story of Caleb Hargrove before you walk into that church social with your eyes half open, Agnes said. I'm not walking in with my eyes half open. You're walking in thinking you have a clear picture and you don't. Agnes sipped her drink. The woman who left him. Her name was Lydia Ashworth. Her family was from San Antonio, Moneyland money, old kind. She and Caleb got engaged when he was 28 after 2 years of courting. His father had just died. He was building the ranch from nothing, and she believed in him. Or she said she did. Said she. Nora waited. Then the fire. He ran into the burning stable to get the horses out. He was in there long enough for the roof to catch him on the way out. By the time they got the bandages on him, he couldn't see, couldn't hear much out of the left ear. Agnes's voice was quiet. Not soft. Agnes Draper was never soft, but careful. Lydia came to see him 3 days later. He was still in the bed. He asked her once if she was all right. She said yes. Then she put a letter on the table beside his hand. He couldn't even hold it. Yet his hands were still wrapped, and she said one sentence out loud, and she walked out. One sentence. I cannot love what you have become. Agnes said it flat without inflection, the way you repeat something horrible so you don't have to feel it again. That's what she said, word for word. He never opened the letter, not for 10 years. Nora felt something cold move through her. He burned it 3 days ago, she said without meaning to say it out loud. Agnes looked at her sharply. How do you know that? I saw him coming back from the direction of the old feed shed that night. He had ash on his hands. She paused. I didn't know what it was. Agnes was quiet for the moment. Then something's changing in him. I don't know what, but something. She looked out at the dark road. What I want you to know, what you need to know before you go into that social, is that Vivian Caldwell is Lydia Ashworth's niece. Lydia's her mother's youngest sister. Vivian grew up hearing about Caleb Hargrove, the rancher, who got ruined the prize her aunt threw away, the cautionary tale about marrying for love instead of sense. Nora sat very still. And somewhere along the way, Agnes continued, she decided she wanted him. Not Caleb the man, Caleb the ranch. Caleb, the name Caleb, the story she'd been told her whole life. She's been at it for 5 years and she's never gotten past his gate. She paused. She also knows because Lydia told her exactly where the wound is. She knows what happens if you press the right place. Nora set down her glass carefully. She knows how to break him. She knows what broke him before. That's not quite the same as knowing how to break him. But in the hands of someone with bad intentions, it's close enough. Nora looked at the dark sky for a long time. The stars were enormous out here. She had not been prepared for how enormous the Texas sky was, how much room there was in it. He burned the letter, she said again softly, not to Agnes, just to herself. Something had changed in him. Something was trying to change. She didn't know yet whether it would succeed or what she had to do with any of it. She was terrified to find out. And she could feel with a certainty that frightened her far more than Edmund's fists ever had that she was going to find out anyway. What? TM. The church social arrived on a Sunday so hot that Reverend Cross cut his sermon to 11 minutes and nobody complained. Nora wore her best dress, which meant the black one with the slightly less frayed cuffs, and Agnes had pressed it and said nothing about the fraying and handed it back with a small nod that meant more than most people's long speeches. The churchyard was full by the time they arrived. Tables of food appeared from nowhere, the way food always appeared at small-town gatherings, in quantities that suggested the making of it had been a matter of considerable quiet competition. Nora recognized faces she'd been memorizing since her first day, Mrs. Patterson, who bought fabric on Tuesdays and always asked for more than she needed. The blacksmith, whose name was Fuller, and who was missing 2 fingers on his right hand and used the remaining 3 with startling dexterity. The school teacher, Miss Briand, who was not much older than Nora, and had the bright-eyed wariness of someone who had learned to be cautious in this town. She was doing well. She was making small talk and taking up just enough space in the conversation to seem friendly without seeming presumptuous. She was fitting in. Then Vivian Caldwell arrived and the afternoon became something else. She came in a dress the color of cream with her father at her elbow. Franklin Caldwell, tall and silver-haired, and carrying himself with the specific confidence of a man who owned the only bank in a 50-mile radius. He nodded to people with the magnanimity of someone distributing small favors. Vivian moved at his side like something that had been sharpened. She found Nora within 2 minutes. "Mrs. Vance?" The smile was already in place. "How lovely that you could join us. I was just telling Father how admirable it is a woman alone starting over from nothing. It takes a particular kind of courage." Nora heard the churchyard conversation slow around them, the way sounds slow before a storm. "Thank you, Miss Caldwell." Father wanted to mention. Vivian turned, slightly drawing Franklin into the conversation with practiced ease. "We do try to take care of those in difficult circumstances here. The church has a fund for widows, and I work for Mr. Abernathy," Nora said pleasantly. "I earn my own keep, but it's kind of you to mention it." Vivian's smile held its shape. "Of course, how industrious. Though I do wonder," she tilted her head slightly, "some people have been asking about your husband's situation, how he died, the circumstances. Small towns are curious about these things, as I'm sure you know." The churchyard had gone very quiet. Nora felt the familiar cold settling over her, the one she'd learned in years of Edmund's cruelties to use as a tool rather than let use her. She arranged her face into something calm and said in a voice that carried exactly as far as Vivian intended, "My husband was shot by a man he'd defrauded. I wasn't present. I settled the debts he left and came west to start again. If there are specific questions, I'm happy to answer them directly." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a crowd that had expected drama and received honesty instead and wasn't sure what to do with it, too. Into that silence came the sound of a cane striking packed earth. Reverend Cross limped forward from the edge of the gathering. He moved slowly, but he moved with the unhurried certainty of a man who had survived things that would have stopped lesser people and knew exactly how much space his authority occupied. "This is a fellowship gathering," he said in a voice that had once carried across rifle fire. "Mrs. Vance is a member of this community who has conducted herself in my observation with integrity and hard work. If anyone here has a genuine concern, they may bring it to me in private as Christian charity instructs." He turned his eyes to Vivian, just looked at her, the way mountains look at weather. Vivian held his gaze for 2 seconds, then she looked away. The afternoon resumed. Conversation started up again. Food was eaten. Someone produced a fiddle. The particular crisis passed in the way small crises pass in small towns, not resolved, just submerged back beneath the surface, where it would continue working quietly. Jesse Crane appeared at Nora's elbow near the end of the afternoon. He was eating a piece of pie with the focused attention of a boy who hadn't eaten much lately. "You handled that," he said. "I've had practice." He chewed. "Miss Vivian does that to people she doesn't want here. I noticed. She's been doing it to," he stopped, "to anyone who gets close to Caleb Hargrove." Jesse looked at her sideways. "You're not close to him." "No, but." "There's no but, Jesse." He didn't look convinced. After a moment, he said quietly, "My ma wanted me to tell you thank you for the reading lessons." Nora had been spending an hour each evening at the Crane house on the way back from the store, going over words and simple sentences with Jesse while his mother rested in the next room. It had started because she'd seen him trying to parse a supply list one afternoon and realized he was sounding out the letters the way a much younger child would. She had offered without thinking too hard about it. "How is she?" she asked. "Not good." He said it with the flat brevity of someone who has said a hard thing so many times that the words have worn smooth. "Doc says another winter maybe. Maybe not that." Nora was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." "It ain't your fault." He picked up the last of the pie. "It ain't anybody's fault, really. It's just," he stopped again. Then in a different voice, "Caleb paid for the last doctor visit. I didn't ask him. Gus told me Caleb sent word to Doc Murray paid the bill before my ma even knew there was one." Nora looked at him. Jesse's jaw was set. "I don't know what to do with that," he said. "I don't know if that makes him a good man, or if it's just, I don't know." He stood up abruptly. "Ma asked me not to stay out past dark." He left. Nora watched him go. She thought about a man who had burned a letter after 10 years, who had quietly paid a doctor bill for the son of a man he might have wronged, who had stopped in a doorway to ask about a piano and said the truest thing anyone had said to her in years. She thought there are many kinds of damage. There are the kinds people do to you, and the kinds you do to yourself, and the kinds the world does without anyone's permission. And sometimes if you're very careful and very honest and very, very lucky, the people carrying the same kinds of damage find each other. She was afraid of what came next. She was going to walk toward it anyway. The rain came on a Tuesday. In Red Mesa, rain was not a casual event. It arrived with the gravity of something that had been discussed for a long time and had finally made up its mind. The sky went from brass to pewter in the space of an hour, and by mid-morning the main street was empty, except for the sound of it on the awnings. Nora was alone in the store. Abernathy had gone to the land office to dispute a surveying error on his property line, a matter that had been festering for 3 months and apparently required his personal attention on the one morning that the sky decided to fall. He had left her with the key, a list of pending orders, and the instruction not to extend any credit to the Farley brothers, who had been carrying a tab since February. She had done all the orders by 10 o'clock. The store was quiet the way places get quiet when weather has driven everyone indoors. Outside rain fell in straight curtains. The street was silver. Nora stood at the counter for a while listening to it. Then, without quite deciding to, she walked to the back corner of the store where the old piano sat half hidden behind the feed sacks. It was a Chickering upright, she thought maybe 1860s, maybe older. The veneer was lifting at the corners and several keys had yellowed to the color of old teeth. She sat down on the stool and lifted the fallboard and touched one key just to hear it. It was badly out of tune. The note rang flat and then continued to ring unresolved in the empty store. She played a scale anyway. Then another. Her hands found the muscle memory of 4 years of teaching the exercises she had given to reluctant students, the patterns that existed in her fingers before they existed in her head. She hadn't touched a piano in 2 years. She hadn't realized how much she had missed it until her hands were on the keys and the missing hit her like a change in air pressure. She began to play something slow. Not a song she could have named, something that had come from her own hands, a meandering melody that moved through the low register and then climbed and then came back. It sounded like the weather. It sounded like the shape of the last 2 years, the fear and the running, and the specific loneliness of a life that had been taken apart so thoroughly that she had to build herself a new one from whatever was left. She played for a long time. At some point, she became aware of a change in the quality of the silence behind her. She did not turn around immediately. She finished the phrase she was in the middle of, let the last note decay, and then let her hands rest on the keys and sat for a moment with her eyes closed. Then she turned. Caleb Hargrove stood in the doorway to the back of the store. He must have come in from the alley entrance, the service door that Abernathy left unlocked during business hours. He was rain-damp, his shoulders dark with it. His hat was in his hand. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, open, unguarded, the way faces look when they have forgotten for a moment to arrange themselves. Neither of them spoke. The rain fell outside. The piano key rang its last faint note. Then Caleb looked at his hat, and something closed in his expression, not the way it had been when she first saw him, but closed the way a window closes when someone remembers that the cold is outside. Abernathy left you alone, he said. Land office business. Farley brothers still running a tab. Since February. A very faint thing happened at the corner of his mouth. He put his hat back on his head. I need wire. Back wall, second shelf. I know where the wire is. She got up from the piano and walked to the back wall and found the wire 14 gauge, which was what he always asked for, and when she turned around, he was closer than she'd expected. Reaching past her for a higher shelf, and for a moment, they were standing very near each other with the rain loud on the roof and the store dim around them. That was yours, he said quietly. Not a question. What you were playing. I suppose it was. I don't have a name for it. It sounded like something being worked through. She looked at him. He was looking at the wire coil in his hands. It did, she said. I was. And did it work? She thought about that honestly. Some of it, the rest takes more than one sitting. He nodded once as though she had said something that confirmed something he already knew. He paid for the wire. He stayed at the counter a moment longer than necessary, turning his hat brim through his hands. You should come to the ranch, he said. He stopped. Started again. Gus's sister is visiting from Austin. She's a widow, been alone a long time. She doesn't know many people out here. I thought, he looked at Nora directly, I thought maybe you two might have things in common, things it's useful to talk about with someone who understands them. It was, Nora realized, one of the most awkward and most careful invitations she had ever received. He was not asking for himself. He was constructing a reason that was technically about someone else while looking at her with eyes that were not about someone else at all. I'd like that, she said. Tell me when. Something released in him. just slightly, just enough to see. Sunday if you're free, after church. I'll be there. He left. The rain continued. Nora sat back down at the piano and played nothing for a while, her hands resting on the keys, listening to the sound of his horse moving away in the wet. Duh. Clara Parrish was not what Nora had expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Someone delicate, perhaps, or overly cheerful in the exhausting way of people who have decided grief must be managed rather than experienced. What she found on that Sunday afternoon at the Tucker at the Hargrove Ranch was a small woman in her mid-50s, with silver hair and a dry wit, and the unguarded, slightly wary eyes of someone who had gotten very tired of pretending to be fine. The ranch itself surprised her too. She had expected cold. Everything she'd heard about Caleb suggested a man who had stripped his life down to function. But the house, while spare, was full of quiet evidence of a person who paid attention to things. The books along one wall, philosophy, history, a few novels she recognized. A horse blanket of exceptional quality folded over the porch railing. A kitchen garden, small and precise, planted by someone who understood both horticulture and aesthetics. Caleb disappeared after the introductions to the stable, presumably, or the pasture, or wherever men go when they have arranged a thing and want it to proceed without their uncomfortable presence. Clara poured tea. For a while, they were both careful. Then Clara said without preamble, "He hasn't had a woman at this ranch in over 10 years. Not since, well, you'll know the story already if you've been here more than a week. I know a version of it." The woman, Clara said, was not a good person. I want to say that clearly because I've watched people spend 10 years making excuses for her, saying she was young, saying she was frightened, saying anyone might have reacted badly. Lydia Ashworth was not a good person. She was beautiful and she knew it, and she decided that beauty was a kind of currency, and she spent it on Caleb because he was handsome and successful, and she thought he was a safe investment. She sipped her tea. When the investment changed value, she sold. That's very cold. Yes, Clara set down her cup. And what she said to him, that one sentence, I've never forgiven her for that. You can leave a person and be wrong about it, but you don't have to be cruel on your way out. She looked at Nora. He never spoke about it again. He just closed. And now, Clara smiled, a small, private thing. Now he's asked a woman to Sunday tea for the first time in 10 years. And his foreman says he came back from town last week looking like he'd been struck by lightning and hadn't quite figured out whether to tell anybody. She tilted her head. What did you do to him? I looked at his face, Nora said simply. Just looked at it, without flinching. Claire was quiet for a moment. That would do it, she said. They talked for 3 hours, about grief and about the specific loneliness of a life rebuilt from the wrong materials, about what it meant to start again at an age when starting again was not supposed to be necessary. Clara had lost her husband at Chancellorsville 20 years ago, and she had never remarried, and she said that had been the right decision for her, and a wrong one in the specific way that right decisions sometimes are. When Nora finally left as the afternoon light was going golden long, Caleb came back from wherever he'd been. He walked her to her horse. They stood in the yard for a moment with nothing more to say, and everything still to be determined. She's wonderful, Nora said. Clara, she is. She's also the only person who tells me the truth without apology. A pause. Besides Gus, and Gus mostly tells me the truth in the form of a question. Like what? Like, you don't think you've been staring at that fence post for 10 minutes, do you, boss? Nora laughed. It surprised her, a real laugh, not the managed safe laughs she had practiced in the years of Edmund. Caleb looked at the sound as though it were something he hadn't been expecting and wasn't sure what to do about, but didn't want to stop. Sunday after next, he said, if you'd like to come back. I'd like to come back. She rode home in the long golden light with something warm and frightening lodged in her chest. And she did not try to name it, and she did not try to talk herself out of it. And she thought about a man who kept philosophy books and planted a kitchen garden and had arranged a tea to avoid having to ask directly for what he wanted. She thought, I am in so much trouble. She thought good. Chumbo. The slow weeks that followed had a particular quality that Nora would remember later as the most ordinary, extraordinary time of her life. The heat broke slightly in August, enough to breathe. She worked at the store. She visited the Crane house each evening for an hour with a Jesse and his letters, and his stubborn pride at the way words were beginning to arrange themselves into meaning under his hands. She and Caleb moved toward each other in the careful, deliberate way of people who have been burned before and are not willing to be burned again, not because they doubt each other, but because they have learned the cost of moving too fast towards something that turns out not to be real. They talked about everything, about the ranch, the breeding program he was building, the particular bloodlines he had been tracking for 3 years, the horse he was gentling right now that no one else had been able to get a saddle on, about her music and the students she'd had in St. Louis, the small girl who had cried when Nora left, and the middle-aged banker who had learned to play Chopin with the intense, earnest focus of a man who had spent 30 years pretending not to have a soul. About Edmund gradually in pieces, in the oblique and careful way of someone learning to trust the ground under their feet. One evening, sitting on the porch of the boarding house, as the sky went dark, she told him about the years she'd known. "I found the documents," she said, "in the study. Edmund kept a locked box. I'd never tried to open it. But one day he left his key on the kitchen table by accident, and I opened it, and I saw what was in it." She looked at her hands. Names of farmers, dollar amounts, dates. It was all there. Everything he'd taken from people who couldn't afford to lose it. Caleb was quiet. "I put it back," she said. "I locked the box again and put the key on the table and went to the kitchen and made supper. And I told myself it was possible I had misunderstood. And the next day I told myself the same thing. And for a year I kept telling myself." She looked up. "It was a lie. I knew it was a lie. But I didn't know what telling the truth would cost me, and I was afraid." Caleb turned toward her on the porch steps. The lamp from inside the house cast one side of his face in gold, left the scarred side in shadow. He looked at her for a long time with those storm-gray eyes and said finally, "What would you have done differently?" Not a question the way most people ask questions, a real one. "I would have gone to the authorities," she said. "I would have told what I knew. I would have ended my own security and stayed and faced it. And if you'd done that, Edmund would have gone to prison. The farmers would have had their money back, some of it, and I would have lost everything before I lost it anyway." She paused. "But the other people would have been protected." "Yes," Caleb said, "they would have. No absolution. No telling her it was all right, just yes, that's what would have been different." She had not, she realized, wanted absolution. She had wanted to say the true thing out loud to someone who wouldn't flinch at it, and she had found it. She reached over and touched the back of his hand briefly, just her fingers on his knuckles. He turned his hand over and closed it around hers carefully, like something he didn't want to break. They sat like that for a while. The stars came out. Somewhere down the road, a coyote said something to the dark. "Lydia kept a letter," he said after a while. "I burned it 3 days before you came." "I know. Agnes told me about her." "Then you know she left because of the scar." "Yes." He looked at their joined hands. "I understood it in a way. The scar was not a small thing at the beginning. I understood why someone would flinch. What I did not understand was saying it that way in that room when I couldn't move to stop her from leaving." He stopped. "I kept the letter because I thought it meant something about what I was, what I would always be, someone unlovable enough to be left in a hospital bed." Nora felt something in her chest that hurt, in the way that only kindness can hurt. "You burned it," she said. "I burned it." He looked at her. "Because I stopped believing it." They sat in the warm dark not speaking, and it was enough. 3 weeks after the church social, the first blow came. It did not come from Vivian directly, it came through Agnes, which was subtler and therefore worse. Agnes was sitting at the kitchen table one morning when Nora came down for breakfast, and there was a paper on the table, and Agnes's face had a look on it that Nora had not seen before. Not quite distress, but its close relative. "Sit down," Agnes said. The paper was a letter. It had come, Agnes said, from a women's charitable society in St. Louis, responding apparently to an inquiry about one Nora Vance, widow of Edmund Vance. The letter was detailed. It spoke of Edmund's fraud, which was not surprising, but it also spoke of Nora. It suggested she had been aware of the fraud for a year before Edmund's death. It suggested she had benefited from it. It used words like complicity and willful blindness, and in one careful phrase, possible flight from investigation. Every word of it was true in the worst possible way. Not fabricated, but assembled from real facts in the order that made the worst possible picture. The way you can take 3 true things and arrange them to constitute a lie. "I didn't write this inquiry," Agnes said. "I know. Vivian Caldwell's father has connections in St. Louis. He helped set up the Merchants Exchange there 10 years back." Agnes folded her hands on the table. "And Vivian knew enough about your past to know where to write." Nora picked up the letter and read it twice. Her hands were very steady. She had learned in the years with Edmund to keep her hands steady when everything else was shaking. "This is going to spread," she said. "Parts of it already have. I found it this morning, but it came yesterday. Vivian made sure it passed through 2 or 3 sets of hands before it reached mine." Agnes looked at her steadily. "Nora, is any of it true?" "I knew," Nora said. "For a year, I didn't report it. Everything else in that letter is interpretation." Agnes was quiet for a moment. "You need to tell Caleb before he hears it from someone else." Nora stood up from the table. "I know. Vivian's going to push this. She'll frame it as protecting him, keeping him from a woman with a damaged past." "I know." Nora set the letter back on the table. She felt oddly calmer than she had expected to feel. Perhaps because this was not a new kind of damage. She knew this specific landscape. She had walked it before. "I'll go to the ranch this afternoon." She found him at the paddock fence watching the gray horse. He'd been working, a tall, fractious animal with a beautiful line and a deep distrust of people that Caleb had been patiently, methodically dismantling for 3 months. The horse was standing near the fence, not far from Caleb's hand, not quite close enough to touch. Caleb heard her come and turned. He took one look at her face and came to the fence gate and met her there. She told him everything. Not the version she told Agnes, the whole version. The locked box, the year of knowing, the calculated silence. She told it standing up, looking directly at him, because she had decided a long time ago that if she was going to be honest about this, she was going to be honest all the way through and not protect herself from the consequences of it. When she finished, Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The letter that's going around." "Yes." Vivian had this made up. She had the real information arranged to look worse than it is, which is almost more dangerous than a lie you can simply disprove. He turned and looked at the gray horse, who had come a half step closer to the fence in the quiet. "You knew," he said, not accusatory, not absenting himself from the situation, just naming the fact. "Yes." "And you said nothing." "Yes." He turned back to her. His eyes were steady, assessing the eyes of someone who was doing a real calculation, not a performed one. "Why are you telling me all of it? You could have given me the easy version. Said you found out only after he died. Said the letter was entirely fabricated." "Because you told me the truth about Tom Crane," she said. "You told me you might have been wrong and you don't know how to fix it. You told me that without any protection for yourself. I'm not going to lie to you." He was quiet again. The horse moved another half step toward the fence. "What happened to the farmers?" Caleb asked. "The ones Edmund defrauded. Some recovered, some didn't. I don't know all the names." She looked at him. "That's the part I can't fix. That's the part I have to carry." Caleb put his hand on the fence rail. His knuckles were white. Not from anger at her, she understood, from something else. Something being worked out in the stillness of him. "I'm not going to ask you to justify it," he said finally. "I'm not going to tell you it was all right because you were afraid. It wasn't all right. The people who lost money suffered for it." He paused. "But I know what it is to make a decision under fear and spend years trying to understand whether you were a coward or a survivor. I don't think those are different things." He looked at her directly. "I don't think this changes what I know about you." Nora exhaled. Something in her chest released quietly without drama. "What do you want to do about the letter?" he asked. "Fight it. Find who Vivian paid, find the trail, expose the selective framing. You'd need evidence?" "Yes," she paused. "And there's something else. Something I found out." She told him then what Agnes had mentioned in passing, what she had since confirmed from Clara, who had known the Ashworth family in San Antonio. About Lydia Ashworth. About the family connection to the Caldwells. About Vivian growing up with the story of the broken engagement with a man named Caleb Hargrove as the prize her aunt had foolishly discarded. Caleb went very still. "She knows about Lydia," Nora said. "About what she said to you. She's been using it, pressing on it, not because she wants to heal you, but because she knows where the wound is." He was silent for a long time. The gray horse in the paddock finally put its nose over the fence rail and exhaled warm breath against Caleb's shoulder. "She's connected to Lydia," he said at last. "Her aunt." He looked at the horse. He looked at Nora. He looked at the vast, pale sky over Red Mesa. "I need to think," he said. "I know. Not about you," he said quickly. "I'm not thinking about you and whether to trust you. That's not what I'm working out." He met her eyes. "I'm thinking about Lydia, about whether I can look at this situation clearly as long as that's still unresolved in me." Nora understood. She understood it better than she could have said. "Whatever you need to do," she said. "I'll wait." He reached out then and took her hand the way he had on the porch carefully like something held with two hands because the alternative was dropping it. "Don't wait too long," he said. "I've been wasted enough time already." She squeezed his hand. He held it. The gray horse watched them both with profound, unconcerned equanimity. Knitted. 2 days later, Caleb Hargrove told Gus he was going to San Antonio. He did not explain why. He said he would be back in 4 days. He asked Gus to check in on Nora while he was gone. Gus, who knew Caleb better than anyone alive, did not ask the reason. "You sure about this, boss?" was all he said. "No," Caleb said. "That's why I'm going." He rode out at first light alone. Nora watched him go from the window of the general store, a bolt of canvas in her hands, and felt something cold and complicated move through her. Not doubt, not fear of losing him. Something older than that, the particular dread of watching a person you love walk toward the thing that broke them, knowing you cannot go with them, knowing they have to do it alone. She went back to work. She cataloged the new shipment. She helped Mrs. Patterson find dress fabric. She extended no credit to the Farley brothers. And she waited. Jesse Crane found her at closing time. He had the look, he sometimes got the jaw set, the eyes watchful. The specific bearing of a boy who has decided to do a difficult thing and wants to do it before he loses nerve. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "I did something." "Tell me." He had found Mr. Doyle. It had not been difficult, he explained. Once he knew to look, once Nora had told him about the false debt claims about the man who had appeared at ranches across the county claiming to represent creditors, Jesse had asked around in the way that 15-year-olds ask around, which is to say by being invisible and listening carefully in places where people forget children exist. Mr. Doyle was staying at the saloon's back room. He had been drinking steadily for 3 days and showing no signs of leaving. Jesse had gone to him that afternoon while Caleb was on the road south, and Nora was in the store, and no one who would have told him not to was available. He had told Doyle that he knew who'd hired him and what for, and that if Doyle did not tell him everything, Jesse would go to the county sheriff himself and tell everything he knew. Doyle had laughed. Then he'd looked at the boy's face. He had not laughed again. "He talked," Jesse said. "Jesse." Nora looked at him carefully. "You walked into a saloon and threatened a man who was hired to intimidate people." "I brought Fuller the blacksmith," Jesse said. "He waited outside." Nora stopped. "That's slightly better." Jesse held out a piece of paper. He had written it all down in his careful, newly literate hand. Doyle's real name, Henderson from Abilene, the amount he'd been paid, the name of the woman who had paid him, the specific documents he had been given to present as evidence of debts. All of it in Jesse's careful block letters with Henderson's signature at the bottom, achieved through a combination of Jesse's stubborn insistence and Fuller the blacksmith's silent presence outside the door. Nora read it twice. Her hands were very steady. "You did this for me," she said. Jesse looked at his boots. "I did it because it was right." "Jesse." He looked up. His eyes were the eyes of a boy who was not quite a boy anymore. "You taught me to read. You sat in my ma's kitchen every night for 2 months, and you didn't ask for anything, and you didn't make her feel like charity. I don't—" He stopped. Tried again. "I don't know if Caleb was right about my pa or wrong. I don't know if I'll ever know, but I know you're being lied about, and I know how to stop it, and so I stopped it." Nora pressed the paper to her chest. She did not cry. She had learned in the years with Edmund to save her tears for things that could not be fixed, and this was something that could. But she felt the warmth of it, the extraordinary human warmth of a 15-year-old boy who had swallowed his pride and his anger and chosen the right thing over the easier one. "Your father," she said carefully. "You said you found letters." Jesse nodded. "Whatever those letters mean, whatever happened between your father and Caleb." She paused. "What you did today was about who you are, not who he was. Do you understand me?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded again slowly, like a weight coming off. "Come for reading tomorrow evening," she said. "Your mother should hear what you did." He almost smiled. "She'll be annoyed I went to the saloon. She'll be proud of you. The annoyed part will come second." He left. Nora stood in the empty store with the paper in her hands and the evidence against Vivian Caldwell laid out in a 15-year-old's careful block letters, and she thought, "We are not finished yet, but we are close to the end of the part where they control the story. From here," she thought, "we take it back." Titu. Caleb returned on the 4th day as promised. He arrived in the evening when the last light was painting the mesa walls the color of old copper. Nora was at Agnes's boarding house on the porch, waiting in the way she had been waiting since he left. Not anxious exactly, but present in a way that felt like holding her breath very slowly. She heard his horse before she saw him. She recognized the sound of his particular animal obey with one white sock the way you recognize a sound you have been listening for. He dismounted at the hitching post and came up the porch steps and sat down in the other rocking chair and looked at the darkening street for a while without speaking. Nora waited. She had learned in the weeks of knowing him that Caleb Hargrove processed things at his own pace and that rushing him produced nothing but a closed door. "She's old," he said finally. "Lydia, 60 maybe, older looking, lives in a good house near the plaza in San Antonio. Her husband died 4 years ago. Second husband, a merchant, seemed to have been a decent man from what the neighbors say." He paused. "She knew who I was the moment she opened the door." Nora looked at him. His profile against the evening sky was sharp and steady. "Did she say anything?" She cried. He said it without particular emotion, as though reporting a weather event. "She invited me in. She had the housekeeper bring tea. And then she told me that she had thought about that day, the day she left, every day since." He was quiet for a moment. "She said she'd been a coward. She said she'd been 25 and terrified, and she had looked at me in that hospital bed and seen her whole life changing, and she'd panicked." He paused again. "She said the sentence she spoke out loud was what her mother had always told her to say to end engagements without drama. She hadn't thought about what it would mean to the person hearing it." "What did you say?" "Nothing for a while." He turned his head and looked at Nora. "Then I told her the sentence didn't break me. The choosing did. She had a choice to stay, to go, to say nothing, to say something true, and she chose the cruelest option, whether she meant it to be cruel or not. I told her I understood that she'd been afraid. I told her I didn't forgive her, because forgiveness isn't something I can just produce for someone because they asked for it. But I told her I was done carrying it." Nora felt her chest ache with the precision of it. How did she take that? She cried more. He looked back at the street. "I think she expected to be forgiven. I think she came to it prepared for forgiveness, the way people come to church prepared for absolution. She got something different." He was quiet. "I left her there. I think she'll be all right. I think she's been fine mostly for 30 years, except for this one thing she carried. She'll keep carrying it. That's hers to carry, not mine." Nora said nothing for a while. The first stars were appearing. Down the street, someone was playing a harmonica badly and with great enthusiasm. "Are you all right?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness he gave to everything. "I'm lighter," he said. "Not happy about it exactly. Not relieved, or not only that. Just lighter. Like I put down something heavy and my arms don't quite know what to do with themselves yet. They'll figure it out. I expect they will." He turned to look at her, then fully, with those storm-gray eyes that had looked at her for weeks with steadily increasing warmth and still managed to feel like the first time each time. "Jesse Crane came to me this morning, before I even got to the ranch." "I know. He told you what he found. He's a brave kid. He's going to be a remarkable man." "He is." Caleb reached into his coat and withdrew the document Jesse had gotten from Henderson, or rather a clean copy of it, which Caleb had clearly had written out more formally in someone's better hand. He held it in both hands, looking at it. "This is enough. This is more than enough. This puts Vivian Caldwell in serious legal difficulty, and her father with her, if he knew." "Do you want to pursue it legally?" "I want her to be held accountable." He folded the document. "But more than that, I want the truth to be public. I want this town to know what was done, and why, and by whom." He paused. "There are people here who've believed the worst about you for 3 weeks. I want them to know exactly why they were allowed to believe it." Nora looked at him. "You're angry." "On your behalf, yes." He met her eyes. "Is that all right with you?" "I have never in my life had someone be angry on my behalf," she said quietly. "It turns out I find it extremely all right." Something shifted in his face, something warm and complicated that she had begun to learn the language of. He reached across the space between the rocking chairs and took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm and certain. "I want to marry you," he said, flat, direct, not elaborate. "I've been working up to saying that in a way that didn't sound like an ambush, but there isn't a way. I want to marry you. I want you at the ranch. I want—" He stopped, started again. "I've spent 10 years not wanting anything for myself. I want this. I want you. And I'm saying it out loud before I find another reason to keep it in." Nora looked at him for a long time. "I love you," she said. It came out more simply than she expected. No weight to it, no drama, just the true thing set down. "I didn't come here looking for it. I told myself every reason not to feel it. But you are the most honest person I have met in my life. And you are kind in the way that counts, the way that nobody sees. And you looked at what I told you about Edmund, and you didn't tell me it was all right. And she stopped, breathed. Yes, I will marry you if you still want to after the rest of this is finished. I want to before the rest of this is finished, he said, but I understand waiting. Let's finish it first, she said, clean. He brought her hand to his lips briefly without ceremony. Then he let go, and they sat in the comfortable dark, two people who had each decided to stop running and listen to the terrible harmonica and the stars coming out over Red Mesa, and made no plans for the immediate future except the largest one. The next morning, Vivian Caldwell received a visitor. It was not Caleb. It was not Nora. It was Reverend Elias Cross, who arrived at the Caldwell house at 8 in the morning with a folded document in his coat pocket and the unhurried air of a man who has seen much worse than this and is prepared to see it through to its conclusion. He spent 45 minutes inside. When he emerged, his expression was unchanged. That afternoon, he came to Agnes's boarding house and told Nora and Caleb, who was sitting on the porch, what had transpired. I showed her the document, he said. I told her what I intended to say from the church steps if she chose not to address it publicly herself. I told her she had one day to decide. He looked at Nora. She's going to fight it, but Franklin Caldwell knows his daughter has gone beyond what can be managed quietly. He's been told that Henderson is cooperating with the county sheriff. He's been told about the letter to St. Louis and the forgeries and the full extent of it. What will he do? Caleb asked. Reverend Cross considered. He'll try to contain the damage. He loves his daughter in the limited way that a man like Franklin Caldwell loves anything. He'll try to make it small, but he can't make it go away. He looked at them both, one after the other. Be ready for tomorrow. I'll ring the bell at 3 o'clock. We'll be there, Nora said. He nodded. He turned to go. At the gate, he paused and looked back at them, the two of them side by side on the porch in the afternoon heat, the kind of side by side that meant something. I've married a good many couples in this county, he said. Some of them should have waited longer. Some of them waited too long. He looked at Caleb. Don't be the second kind. He went. Caleb looked at Nora. Something like a smile crossed his face, unhurried and real. The Reverend gives pastoral advice efficiently, she said. He does everything efficiently. It's not wrong advice. No, Caleb said. It's not. The bell rang at 3 o'clock precisely. It rang the way Reverend Cross did everything without ambiguity, without apology, with the specific cadence that everyone in Red Mesa had learned to distinguish from the Sunday bell and the Saturday evening bell and the bell for emergencies. This was the unscheduled bell, the bell that meant come now, come and see. Within 20 minutes, most of Red Mesa was in the churchyard. They came from the bank and the livery and the general store, from the kitchens and the pastures at the edge of town. They came because small towns run on information the way rivers run on water, and the drought had been going on for 3 weeks since the letter had arrived, and the rumors had spread, and the murmuring had taken the shape it always takes when people know enough to be suspicious and not enough to be fair. Nora stood on the church steps with the documents in her hands and Caleb at her shoulder, and waited for the noise to settle. She had done this before, she reminded herself. Not this exactly, not standing before a community that had formed opinions about her and asking it to reform them. But she had stood in rooms where everything was against her, and she had spoken clearly anyway. She had survived Edmund. She had survived St. Louis. She had walked into this town with $3 silver and nothing else, and had built something here that was worth protecting. She was not afraid. She was something closer to ready. When the yard went quiet, the particular listening quiet of a crowd that has suspended its various conversations to wait and see, Nora began. I know why you're here, she said. Her voice was steady. It carried. There's been a letter making the rounds and rumor attached to it, and I understand why people believed what it seemed to say. I'm not here to ask your forgiveness for any of that. I'm here to show you the truth and let you decide for yourselves. She held up the first document. This is a certified record from the St. Louis County Courthouse showing that the estate of Edmund Vance was settled in full 2 years ago. Every creditor of record was paid or had their claims dismissed. There are no outstanding debts from that estate. She paused to let that land. She saw faces shifting, doubt entering where certainty had been. This, she held up the second, is a sworn statement from the attorney who handled my husband's estate, confirming the same. He offers to testify in person if required. The murmurs were starting now. She let them. And this, The third document, Jesse's careful block letters and Henderson's signature, is a written confession from a man calling himself Doyle, real name Henderson, from Abilene. He admits that he was hired to impersonate a legal representative and present false claims of debt. He names the person who hired him. He names the amount he was paid. He names the documents he was given, documents that were created, forged specifically to destroy my reputation in this town and drive me out of it. She walked down the steps, then into the crowd, and let people read it. Let them pass it from hand to hand. Let the court seals and the signatures and the dated confessions speak for themselves, because words spoken in accusation need to be answered with more than other words. The crowd parted in front of her, and she walked toward the back of the churchyard where Vivian Caldwell stood with her father's hand at her elbow, her face the white of something that has been drained completely. "Miss Caldwell," Nora said, not loudly, not for the crowd, directly, quietly between them. "Would you like to respond to Mr. Henderson's statement?" Vivian's jaw tightened. Her eyes moved over the crowd, measuring, calculating. She had her father's hand and her father's money in the social machinery she had operated for years. But the crowd was not with her. She could see it. The thing she had built was coming apart in the warm afternoon air. "This is," she began. "Before you say it's fabricated," Nora said, still quietly, "be aware that Henderson has already spoken to Sheriff Raines. He's cooperating fully. There are 2 other people in this town who can confirm the payments and the instructions. Your father's connection to the St. Louis inquiry has been documented." She paused. "Whatever you say in the next 30 seconds is going to define what the rest of this looks like." Vivian looked at her father. Franklin Caldwell's face was the face of a man watching something he had built slowly and deliberately crumble beyond any possible repair. Then something unexpected happened. Vivian straightened. She stopped looking at her father. She stopped looking at the crowd. She looked only at Nora, and then slowly, as if something that had been coiled tight for a long time was finally releasing at Caleb. "I've spent my entire life," she said, and her voice, for the first time Nora had heard, it was stripped of its performance, being told that Caleb Hargrove was the standard. She looked at him steadily. "My aunt left him, and my family spent 30 years deciding it was the great mistake of her life. I grew up aping it. I grew up believing it. I believed that the measure of a woman's ambition was whether she could get what Lydia Ashworth threw away." She stopped. "I didn't want you. I want to be honest about that. I wanted the story. I wanted to be the woman who fixed what Lydia broke." The churchyard was very quiet. Caleb said nothing. He was looking at Vivian with an expression that Nora had learned to read, not soft, not forgiving, but honest, fully present. "What you did to Mrs. Vance," he said at last, "was wrong. I don't think you know exactly how wrong. You tried to send a woman to prison because she stood between you and a story you'd been told about yourself. That's not ambition. That's the kind of cruelty that comes from never being told no by anyone who loved you enough to mean it." Vivian flinched. Her father moved beside her. Whatever he was going to say, Nora saw him open his mouth, saw the automatic impulse to defend to cover died before he spoke. Franklin Caldwell looked at the documents in people's hands. He looked at his daughter's face stripped of its performance for possibly the first time in his presence. He looked at the crowd, at the expressions that were not condemnation of Vivian, but something more complicated, pity, mostly, and the specific discomfort of people who have participated in something that turned out to be a lie. He was a shrewd man. He understood what the room was and what it was not. "I'll take her home," he said. "You'll do more than that," said Reverend Cross from his position near the church door. His voice was mild. "You'll see to it that the charges pending against Henderson are known to name his employer. You'll see to it that the Vance woman's reputation in this town is repaired through whatever means are available to you. And you'll get your daughter the help she needs, because what happened here is a symptom of something that has been going wrong for a long time." He looked at Franklin directly. "I will be following up." Franklin Caldwell, who was accustomed to being the most powerful man in any room, looked at the old preacher with his cane and his Chickamauga limp in his eyes that had seen much worse than this, and nodded. He put his arm around Vivian. She went with him without struggling, which surprised Nora. The crowd parted. They walked through it, and behind them the yard slowly, quietly reconstituted itself into something that almost felt normal, the particular normalcy that follows a storm that has passed. Then Martha Patterson started it. She stepped forward from the middle of the crowd, a small round woman who had never said anything notable in Nora's hearing, and said in a carrying voice, I've been shopping at Abernathy's for 25 years, and I've never had a clerk who remembered I liked the blue calico best without being told twice. Mrs. Vance remembered the second day. It was a small thing to say. It was not a small thing to say it. Mr. Abernathy stepped forward, next his spectacles slightly crooked on his nose, and said he'd hired better than he'd expected when he hired Nora and left it at that, which from Abernathy was practically a speech. Then Jesse Crane, Jesse, who had come straight from his mother's bedside, who was still 15 years old and carrying more than 15 years of weight, pushed through to the front and looked at the crowd and said in a voice that was finding its depth, "She taught me to read. She sat in my mother's kitchen every night for 2 months. She never once made us feel like charity." He paused. "My mother says she's the best person to come through this town since Reverend Cross. My mother is not wrong about people." One by one, people spoke. Not dramatically, not in long speeches, small true things, the kind that pile up into something undeniable, the kind that a woman cannot manufacture and cannot buy. Nora stood in the middle of it with her hands at her sides and felt something she did not quite have a word for. Not just relief, not just gratitude, but the specific warmth of being known, of having been seen quietly in the ordinary daily business, of being herself, and of that being enough. Caleb came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Reverend Cross, from his position by the church door, allowed a silence to fall over the churchyard. And then into it he said, "Well, I believe we've established some things today. Mrs. Vance's reputation stands. The matter of the false claims will be addressed through proper legal channels." He looked around the yard. "And I believe there may be some other business that wants addressing if anyone has the sense to address it." He looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Nora. "I've been working up to this for a while," he said quietly so only she could hear. "And the Reverend's right that I've waited long enough." He took her hand. In front of the assembled town of Red Mesa, in the afternoon light, with the church bells still faintly resonating, and the crowd watching with the collective breath-holding of people who have had enough drama for one day, but could stand one more thing. He took her hand and turned to face her. "I told you I'd been waiting 10 years to stop hiding," he said. "I told you I wanted to marry you. I'm asking now in front of everyone so there's no room for either of us to find a reason later." He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, steady and open and unguarded, in a way that she had learned was the rarest thing he had. "Ruth Nora," he almost smiled. "Nora Vance, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, again, as she had said it on the porch in the dark 3 days ago, but this time in daylight in front of witnesses without qualifications. "Yes." Someone in the crowd made a sound. It spread. Reverend Cross said in his dry, efficient way, "I have a church right here. Seems a waste not to use it." Nora looked at Caleb. He raised his eyebrows, a question. "I've been carrying a black dress for 2 years, she said. "I'm done with it." He laughed. It was the sound she had fallen in love with before she knew she was falling, surprised and genuine and a little rusty from disuse. Agnes Draper appeared from somewhere with a length of white ribbon that she tied in Nora's hair with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of a woman who has decided that sentiment must occasionally be expressed through practical action. Clara Parrish, who had been at the back of the crowd, came forward and pressed Nora's hand and said nothing that required words. Jesse Crane straightened his collar and stood very tall in the way of boys who have decided this moment is worth being tall for. The ceremony was simple. Reverend Cross's voice was steady and clear in the afternoon heat, the words he spoke as old as the country and as new as the moment. Gus Parrish produced rings from somewhere, a plain gold band for Nora Caleb's own signet ring, temporarily repurposed to be replaced properly, later an arrangement that felt right in the way that improvised things often feel right when the right people are improvising. "Do you, Caleb Hargrove, take this woman?" "I do." He said it without hesitation, looking at her the whole time. "Do you, Nora Vance, take this man?" "I do." She said it looking at the scar that ran from the corner of his eye to his jaw, looking at it directly the way she always had because it was a part of him and all of him was worth looking at. "I do with everything I have." "Then by the authority vested in me by the state of Texas and by God Almighty who has been patient with both of you," and here Reverend Cross permitted himself the smallest of pauses, "I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Hargrove, and I suggest you do it before I change my mind about the fee." Caleb kissed her. The crowd made noise. Someone fired a pistol into the air, which was probably Fuller the blacksmith, who did things like that. Agnes Draper was crying with a face that suggested she found this personally embarrassing. Jesse Crane was not crying, but was looking at the sky with the specific expression of someone who is absolutely not crying. When Nora and Caleb finally came apart, both slightly breathless, she looked up at him, at the open, unguarded, entirely present face of a man who had burned a letter after 10 years and decided it was time to put down what he'd been carrying. And she said quietly, only for him, "You're my husband." "You're my wife," he said, like he was still working out what it meant and didn't want to stop working it out. "We should probably go home." "We should probably go home," she agreed. They rode out of Red Mesa in the long gold light of a Texas afternoon, with the celebration still going in the churchyard behind them, the fiddle that someone had found, the tables of food, Agnes Draper, marshaling the town toward festivity with the efficiency of a small general. Caleb and Nora rode side by side, not fast, not with any urgency, through the sage and the red dust and the enormous breathing sky. The ranch house was waiting. It had been waiting, Nora thought, for a long time, 6 rooms and a kitchen and a parlor that had never hosted a party built by a man who had intended to fill it and then stopped intending. He carried her across the threshold. She told him he was going to hurt his back. He said it was worth it. She looked around at the sparse, careful rooms, the books along the wall, the kitchen garden visible through the window, the piano-less parlor that would eventually have a piano, the bedrooms that would eventually have noise in them, and felt something she had almost forgotten was a feeling she was allowed to have. The weight of a thing that might last. "What happens now?" she said. "Now we live," he said. "We build something. We prove," he stopped, smiled a small private thing. "We don't have to prove anything. We just do it." She reached up and touched his face. The scar was warm under her fingers, the same temperature as the rest of him. "All of you," she said, "every piece." He covered her hand with his. Bang. The years that followed were not easy exactly, but they were good in the way that things built carefully tend to be good. The Hargrove Ranch prospered. The breeding program that Caleb had been developing for 3 years paid off in the 4th, and the name Hargrove became the name other ranchers spoke when they talked about quality horses. The big house stopped being big and empty and became something else, full of small daily evidence of 2 people learning to share a life. Jesse Crane's mother passed away in the 2nd winter. Caleb and Nora took him in without discussion, without drama. He simply moved into the room that had been waiting without knowing it was waiting, and that was that. Jesse was 16 by then, nearly a man, and he worked the ranch with a dedication that mixed something like loyalty with something like the particular drive of a boy who has decided to make something of himself in a way his father did not. He never found out for certain what his father had done. He decided eventually to live without knowing, which is its own kind of courage. Clara Parrish stayed eventually permanently in the small room at the east end of the house that got the morning light. She and Nora were sisters in every sense that mattered. She taught the children card games that she claimed were innocent and that were not. The children. There were 3 of them in the end. The first arrived 14 months after the wedding, a girl with Caleb's storm gray eyes and Nora's stubborn chin, who they named Pearl, for no reason either of them could articulate precisely, except that the name felt right. The second was a boy who arrived 2 years later and seemed from his first day constitutionally incapable of being quiet, whom they named after Reverend Cross's given name, which was not Elias but Marcus, which Nora sat with for a moment and then accepted, because not all names that have been attached to pain have to stay attached. The third was another girl, small and watchful and precise, who they named Clara for reasons that required no explanation. Nora opened a school. It began in the parlor, 5 children from the outlying ranches whose nearest schoolhouse was 12 miles away. It moved within 3 years to a small building that Caleb built with Gus's help on the near edge of the north pasture, with 4 desks and a chalkboard and a piano that Caleb bought from a family in Austin who had outgrown it. The school had 12 students by the end of its 2nd year, and Nora taught them reading and arithmetic and music theory, and quietly, without calling it by any particular name, how to think. She taught them to think about the things they knew and were certain of, and to be honest about where the certainty ended. She had learned in the particular school of her own life that the difference between wisdom and foolishness was often just the willingness to know the edges of what you actually knew. Vivienne Caldwell left Red Mesa. Nora heard some years later that she had married a man in Houston and was reported to be content, genuinely content, not the performed kind which required a different kind of woman than Vivienne had been at 25. Perhaps she became that woman. Nora hoped so. Franklin Caldwell remained. He did what the Reverend had asked quietly, without fanfare. He saw to it that the legal consequences for Henderson were known to include his employer's name and that the record of Nora's cleared debts was as public in Red Mesa as the accusations had been. He was not forgiven, but he was not run out of town either, which was what he had feared. People are complicated in their mercies. 20 years. 20 years on a summer evening sitting on the porch they had built together, literally built over one long August weekend with Gus and Jesse, and an amount of imprecision in the measuring that Caleb had found maddening, and Nora had found hilarious watching the sun go down behind the mesa. The house was quiet. Pearl was in Austin studying. The boy was somewhere with Gus, presumably getting into something. Small Clara was in the kitchen with Clara Parrish being taught the card games that were not as innocent as advertised. Caleb's hair had gone silver at the temples. The scar on his face had faded to something barely visible, now a pale suggestion in the evening light. His hands were still the same calloused and certain, and he held hers the same way he always had, carefully, like something that might go somewhere if he let go, but that he didn't intend to let go of. "Do you regret it?" she asked. It was a habit they had, asking each other this every year or so, not from insecurity, but as a kind of accounting, a way of staying honest with each other. "No," he said, as he always said. But this time he continued, "I think about what I was before you. I think about what I was doing to myself in that big empty house, keeping that letter, making sure I stayed broken, because staying broken felt like the only safe thing." He paused. "I think about that as a kind of waste." "You weren't wasting it," she said. "You were just keeping it, waiting." "You can dress it up as waiting," he said with the ghost of a smile she had loved for 20 years, but it was mostly just stubbornness. "Then I'm glad you were stubborn," she said. "I needed exactly your kind of stubborn." He looked at her for a long moment. The evening light was gold and slow. In the kitchen, someone laughed, Clara Parrish's dry laugh followed by Small Clara's delighted shriek at whatever card trick had just been revealed. "I recognized you," he said, "the day you arrived. Not because I knew who you were, I didn't know anything about you, but I recognized the thing you were carrying, the weight of it." He paused. "I thought, here is someone who knows what it costs. And then I thought I should stay very far away from her." "You were terrible at staying far away. The worst." He brought her hand to his lips. "The single most spectacular failure of my adult life." Nora leaned into him, the familiar weight of his arms settling around her shoulders, the way it had settled 1,000 times, easy and certain. Outside, the mesa was turning colors red to gold, to the deep purple of Texas evenings that she had learned to love in the way you love something that surprised you by being exactly what you needed. The windmill turned in the warm wind. The horses were in the pasture, moving slowly in the last light. There were more stars out here than anywhere she had ever been. She had never gotten used to how many there were, and she had stopped trying to. Some things she had learned were not meant to be gotten used to. Some things were meant to be looked at directly without flinching for as long as they lasted. She looked at them. "Yeah, thank you for staying until the end. If this story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Every one of those notifications means another story reaches someone who needed it. Drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel, and we never take your time for granted. New episodes every week. We'll see you in the next one." Damn. Epilogue extended the first year. The first year of marriage was an education in the difference between a life observed from the outside and a life inhabited. Nora had watched Caleb from a distance for weeks before she understood him. She had built a picture of him from fragments, the way he moved through a room with the careful economy of someone who had learned not to take up more space than necessary, the way he held his coffee cup with both hands in the mornings, as though warmth were something to be held on to. The way he went still when he was thinking a stillness that was not absence, but its opposite, the most present she had ever seen anyone be. Living with him was the completion of the picture. She learned things that surprised her, that he woke before dawn every morning and sat on the porch for 20 minutes before anyone else was awake, not reading, not doing anything, just being present in the specific early morning quiet that she came to understand was his version of prayer. She started waking up to join him after the second month, not because he asked her to, but because she found that the early morning quiet was better for having someone in it. She learned that he cried exactly once in the first year at the end of November, sitting at his mother's grave in the small family plot behind the north pasture. She didn't say anything. She sat beside him and waited. When he was done, he said without looking up, "She would have liked you." She put her hand on his arm, and they walked back to the house, and that was all that needed to be said. She learned that he found it difficult to ask for help, not because he was proud, or not only because he was proud, but because the years of isolation had made him genuinely uncertain about whether help was something he had a right to. She worked on this patiently and without comment, finding small ways to make herself useful that were also small ways of teaching him that another person's involvement in your life was not always loss of control, but sometimes its increase. He learned things about her too. He learned that she had nightmares sometimes not about Edmund specifically, but about the quality of that life, the smallness and the shame and the isolation. He learned to wake gently when he felt her stir in the night, to put his hand on her back without speaking, until she came fully awake and could tell herself where she was. She was in Red Mesa, Texas. She was in the house they had built together. The nightmares became less frequent as the months passed, and then rare, and then occasional. And one morning she realized she had slept through the night without waking for the first time she could remember. She told him that morning over coffee. He looked at her for a long moment with something in his face that she had learned to read as the emotion he did not yet have words for, and then he said, "Good." Just that. But the way he said it, she understood it was not simple. Gus Parrish watched all of this with the benevolent satisfaction of a man whose advice had been dramatically vindicated. He never mentioned that he had told Caleb to stop hiding. He didn't need to. The evidence was in the house every day. Clara Parrish arrived in the spring and announced she was staying through summer. She was still there at Christmas. Nobody asked her to leave. Nobody was going to. The matter of Vivian Caldwell resolved itself more slowly than the public confrontation in the churchyard had suggested it would. The legal proceedings against Henderson took 3 months. Franklin Caldwell's attempt to distance himself from his daughter's actions was partially successful. He had not yet emerged known the full extent of what Vivian had done. He had known she was investigating Nora. He had made some inquiries on her behalf. He had not known about Henderson or the forged documents or the depth of the scheme. That distinction mattered legally, if not morally. Henderson spent 30 days in the county jail and was released on the condition that he leave the territory. He did. Vivian was not charged with anything. The evidence was sufficient to demonstrate what she had done, and the county sheriff was clear in his private communication with Franklin Caldwell about what could be charged if Franklin did not ensure appropriate restitution. Franklin ensured it. He quietly paid a sum to the fund that Reverend Cross administered for the community's poorer members, and he publicly acknowledged that the letter sent to St. Louis had contained misleading characterizations of Mrs. Vance, and he arranged for a corrective communication to be sent to the same women's society. It was not justice exactly. It was the particular form of accountability available in a small town where the most powerful man's daughter had done something wrong, and the community had to decide whether to destroy the family or reshape it. Nora chose not to push for more. This surprised some people who had expected, after her public courage in the churchyard, a more complete reckoning. But Nora had spent years watching what the desire for complete reckoning cost people, including herself, and she had decided that what she wanted was not Vivian's destruction, but the protection of everything she had built here. She had that. It was enough. Vivian left Red Mesa 6 months after the confrontation. She did not say goodbye to Nora. She said goodbye to Agnes Draper, of all people, which surprised Agnes considerably. "What did she say?" Nora asked. "She said she was sorry," Agnes told her. "She said she'd spent a long time being someone who collected things that weren't hers, and she thought it was time to stop." Agnes paused. "She asked after you." "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were fine, that you were better than fine." Agnes's expression did not soften exactly, but it shifted. "I told her you were happy."
Yeah.
Jesse Crane grew up. This was not a small thing. It happened visibly, the way some growths do, fast enough to notice week by week. He was 16 when he moved into the ranch house, 17 when he started helping break horses with Caleb, 18 when he sat down one Sunday afternoon and wrote a letter to the county's agricultural extension office, inquiring about their apprenticeship program, having read about it in a newspaper, and having decided on his own, without anyone suggesting it, that he wanted to become something specific. He became a veterinarian eventually. It took years and involved distances that made Nora's chest ache when she thought about them. But he came back. He always came back. He set up his practice in Red Mesa, the first veterinarian the county had, who had actually studied for the purpose, and brought with him a wife from San Antonio, who had strong opinions about card games and immediately became Clara Parrish's favorite person in the family. He told Nora once when he was about 25, and they were sitting on the porch in the long summer evening, that he had never fully resolved the question of his father. I don't think I ever will, he said. No, she agreed. I've decided it doesn't define me. He looked at the sky, then at her. You told me that once, when I was 15. I didn't understand it then. And now I understand that it's true, but I also understand it's hard. He paused. Is it always hard? The things that are worth understanding usually are, she said. He nodded. He looked like the man he had become, capable and steady and honest in the way of people who have had to figure out what honesty costs before they could commit to it. And she felt the particular ache of watching someone you have cared for become themselves. Thank you, he said, for everything, but especially for the reading lessons, because that's where the rest of it started. She did not tell him he was welcome because welcome implied she had done him a favor when what she had done was sit in a dying woman's kitchen and teach a boy his letters because it had been the right thing to do at the time. Instead, she said, you did the work. You showed up, he said. That was most of it. She thought about that for a long time, about how much of the important things come down to that, not greatness, not sacrifice, not even love in its most dramatic form, but the simpler and more ordinary act of showing up, of being present, of keeping the lamp on in an empty house until the house is not empty anymore. She had been shown up for in her life. Agnes, Jesse, Reverend Cross, Clara, and Caleb, who had sat in the dark of his own emptiness for 10 years, and then when she had stood in front of him with $3 silver in a cracked trunk and eyes that saw his scar and did not flinch, had said to himself, here is someone. Here is someone I recognize. She had recognized him back. That was the whole story reduced to its simplest form. Two people who had been damaged in different ways, who recognized each other's damage, who chose carefully against their own fears, against everything that said not to show up for each other. The rest was just the living of it, and the living of it she had found was very fine.